In the savage expanse of the Wyoming Territory, the years following the Civil War birthed countless tales of fearsome gunfighters and merciless outlaws. But none would leave a more bone-chilling legacy than Michael "Iron Hand" Sullivan, a man whose name alone could silence the rowdiest saloons from Cheyenne to Deadwood, a decorated Union cavalry officer turned solitary rancher whose steel-grey eyes had witnessed the horrors of Gettysburg, would ultimately send 33 men to their graves with a chilling philosophy. War taught me that some men mistake kindness for weakness. I stopped being kind in 1863. Join me today as we uncover the story of the man they called Iron Hand, the silent guardian of Thunder Valley, who proved that the deadliest wolves are the ones who hunt alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thunder Valley, Wyoming Territory, spring of 1875. The settlement had sprung up like many others in the wake of the war, a collection of weather-beaten buildings and desperate dreams huddled beneath the towering Bighorn Mountains. It was the kind of place where most folks were running either to something or from something, which suited Michael Sullivan just fine. He rode in on a bitter March morning, leading 2 pack mules loaded with supplies, his Union cavalry greatcoat still bearing the faded bloodstains of a war that had ended a decade ago, but never really left him. Those who witnessed his arrival would later recall 3 distinct details: the distinctive Remington model 1858 revolver, worn cross-draw style, the gloved right hand he never removed, and the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon with the haunted vigilance of a man who'd seen too much death to ever fully lower his guard. Sheriff Thomas Wheeler, a gruff former Texas Ranger who'd tamed his share of boom towns, watched the newcomer from his office porch with growing curiosity. In his weathered journal, he would later write, "Some men carry their war wounds on the outside plain as day. Others carry them deeper, like loaded guns just waiting for someone foolish enough to pull the trigger." Sullivan struck me as the latter. Mary Cooper, owner of the town's only general store, was the first to actually engage with the mysterious newcomer. She noticed how he methodically arranged his purchases on her counter: ammunition, coffee, salt pork, and medical supplies, all sorted with military precision. But it was the way he hesitated before picking up items with his right hand that caught her attention, how he seemed to favor his left, despite clearly not being natural to it. The glove, she noticed, didn't quite conceal the mechanical nature of what lay beneath. Doc William Hayes was the second person to glimpse behind Sullivan's carefully constructed walls, treating him for a minor injury that the rancher claimed came from breaking a wild horse. The doctor couldn't help but notice the collection of scars that painted a roadmap of violence across the veteran's body: the saber slash across his ribs, the puckered bullet wounds that spoke of mini-balls and Confederate lead, and most notably, the sophisticated mechanical prosthetic that had replaced his right hand, a marvel of post-war engineering that moved with uncanny precision when Sullivan flexed it. Within days, Sullivan had purchased the old Davidson Ranch, 2,000 acres of prime grazing land nestled in a remote corner of Thunder Valley. The previous owner, James Davidson, had died under mysterious circumstances the previous winter, leaving his young widow Catherine with more land than she could manage. She'd been holding out for the right buyer, turning down increasingly aggressive offers from both the notorious Carson gang and various cattle barons who'd tried to pressure her into selling. There was something different about him, Catherine would later confide to Mary Cooper over tea. The way he examined the property, checking sightlines and approaches like he was planning for a siege rather than raising cattle. But when he spoke about maintaining the land's legacy, protecting what my Herbert had built, I knew he was the right choice. She couldn't have known then just how prophetic those instincts would prove to be, or how her decision would ultimately save not just the ranch, but the entire valley from a storm of violence that had been brewing long before Sullivan's arrival. The veteran settled into his new property with the systematic efficiency that had once earned him commendations from General Meade himself. He repaired fences, restored the barn, and began building up a modest herd of Hereford cattle. He paid his bills promptly, attended church services, though he never joined in the hymns, and politely declined invitations to social gatherings with the quiet grace of a man more comfortable with solitude than society. Yet there were oddities that didn't escape notice. Mary Cooper, whose store served as the town's unofficial intelligence hub, observed peculiar patterns in his shopping habits. He bought gunpowder in bulk, explaining it away as protection against wolves. His eyes would linger on wanted posters, though he never commented on them. Most tellingly, he had an uncanny habit of positioning himself in corners, keeping every entrance in sight, his gloved right hand never far from that Remington. But it was young Deputy Jimmy Hayes, Doc Hayes's son, and eager to prove himself worthy of his badge, who witnessed something that would later take on almost mythical significance. He'd been riding fence-line patrol near Sullivan's property just before dawn when he saw the veteran practicing with his revolver. "Never seen anything like it," he whispered later at the saloon, his young face pale with awe. 6 shots, 6 targets, across 3 different directions, all while moving. But it wasn't the speed that scared me. It was the way he did it with that mechanical hand, like man and machine had become one deadly whole. The source of Sullivan's martial prowess might have remained a mystery if not for the arrival of Colonel James Blackwood that spring. The retired Union officer had stopped in Thunder Valley while following the construction of the new railroad line, and he was sharing drinks with Sheriff Wheeler when Sullivan walked past the saloon window. The colonel's whiskey glass slipped from suddenly trembling fingers, shattering on the wooden floor as all color drained from his weathered face. "Sweet Lord above," Blackwood whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "The iron hand of Gettysburg. We all thought he was dead." Before Sheriff Wheeler could press for details, fate intervened in the form of thundering hooves. The Carson gang, 15 strong and growing bolder by the day, had just ridden into Thunder Valley. Their reputation preceded them, a trail of broken lives and burning homesteads stretching from Kansas to the Dakota Territory. With them came the first winds of a storm that would shatter the silence surrounding Michael "Iron Hand" Sullivan forever. The air grew thick with tension as Jack Carson's men dismounted, their spurs singing against the wooden sidewalks of Thunder Valley. The town had managed to stay relatively peaceful until now, but everyone knew that was about to change. What they didn't know was that the quiet rancher watching from the shadows of Cooper's general store had been anticipating this moment since the day he'd first heard the Carson name mentioned in whispers. Sheriff Thomas Wheeler had seen enough trouble in his 20 years of law enforcement to recognize the smell of gun smoke before the first shot was fired. As the Carson gang spread through Thunder Valley like a cancer, he pulled the still-shaken Colonel Blackwood into his office, closing the door on the growing chaos outside. The old wood creaked with age, a sound nearly lost beneath the rising din of trouble brewing in the street. "All right, Colonel," Wheeler said, pulling a bottle of Kentucky bourbon from his desk drawer and pouring 2 generous measures. "Why don't you tell me what's got you looking like you've seen a ghost walking?" He pulled up a chair, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. Years of experience had taught him that men like Blackwood didn't spook easily, and anything that could rattle a veteran officer was worth hearing about. Blackwood drained his glass in one swallow, his hands still trembling. "That's exactly what I saw, Thomas, the iron hand of the Army of the Potomac." He leaned forward, lowering his voice though they were alone. "That man you call Sullivan? His real name is Captain Michael O'Sullivan. He commanded the 7th Cavalry Scout Unit during the war, the most effective reconnaissance force in the Union Army. But it was at Gettysburg where he earned his true reputation. The revelation hung in the air like gun smoke. Wheeler had heard whispers of the Iron Hand of Gettysburg. Every veteran had. A Union cavalry officer who'd lost his hand in a Confederate artillery strike, but returned to duty with a mechanical prosthetic crafted by the finest engineers in Philadelphia. They said he could shoot and ride better with that iron hand than most men could with flesh and bone. The stories claimed he died in '65, ambushed by Confederate guerrillas in the war's final days. I was there that 3rd day at Gettysburg. Blackwood continued, his eyes distant with memory. When Pickett's charge broke against our lines, a group of Confederate cavalry tried to swing around our flank. O'Sullivan and his scouts were all that stood between them and our rear, 15 men against over 100 rebels. Do you know what he did? Wheeler refilled their glasses, buying time to process this information. Tell me everything, James. If we've got the Iron Hand of Gettysburg in our town, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Blackwood's weathered face grew distant with memory. He positioned his men behind a stone wall, waited until the rebels were almost on top of them. Then, God help me, I've never seen anything like it. That mechanical hand of his never seemed to slow down his shooting. He dropped 12 men himself before they even realized they were under fire. The rest of his scouts accounted for maybe 30 more. The rebels broke and ran, but O'Sullivan wasn't done. He led a countercharge that scattered them completely, saved our entire right flank. Outside, the Carson gang was making their presence known. Jack Carson, the youngest brother, had already started a fight at the saloon, his drunken whoops mixing with the sound of breaking glass and frightened piano notes. Matthew Carson was methodically visiting each business along Main Street, making what he called friendly suggestions about protection payments, his quiet voice and light smile somehow making the threats even more menacing. Luke Carson himself remained mounted on his blood-bay stallion, watching the town with the calculating eyes of a wolf sizing up its prey. His reputation for cruelty was well earned. He'd once burned down an entire farmstead just to catch one man who'd crossed him. The silver spurs on his boots caught the afternoon sun as he shifted in his saddle, studying every detail of Thunder Valley like a general planning a campaign. If you're enjoying this tale of courage and justice in the Old West, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got more stories of legendary gunfighters coming your way that you won't want to miss. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At Cooper's General Store, Mary found herself face-to-face with 2 of Carson's men who had invaded her normally peaceful establishment. They were going through her inventory, helping themselves to whatever caught their fancy. One was tall and lean, with a distinctive dueling scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. Tom Quick Draw Wilson, known for killing 3 men in Dodge City over a poker game. The other was shorter but powerfully built, wearing a slouch. That had once belonged to a Confederate cavalry officer, Samuel Bloody Sam Tucker, whose reputation for brutality rivaled that of the Carson brothers themselves. Luke wants to have a friendly chat about your business arrangements, Wilson drawled, casually pushing merchandise off her shelves. The crash of breaking bottles punctuated his words. Times are getting dangerous in Thunder Valley. Shame if something were to happen to this nice establishment of yours. The bell above the door chimed softly. Michael Sullivan stood in the doorway, his presence somehow filling the entire room despite his quiet demeanor. He didn't speak, didn't reach, for his Remington just stood there with those steel-gray eyes that Colonel Blackwood had recognized. The thin mountain sunlight streaming through the windows caught the brass and steel mechanisms of his gloved right hand as he flexed it almost imperceptibly. "This ain't your concern, cripple," Tucker sneered, his hand drifting toward his holster. "Best move along before things get unfriendly." Sullivan didn't move. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the store with the same deadly precision he'd once used to direct cavalry charges. "The lady doesn't need any new arrangements." The tension in the store grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Mary had never heard Sullivan string so many words together at once. There was something different about his voice now, an edge of command beneath the quiet tone, like the whisper of a saber being drawn from its scabbard. The outlaws exchanged glances, sizing up the situation. They'd been told the town was soft, easy pickings. The one-handed rancher in the doorway didn't fit that description. Something in his stance, the way he held himself perfectly still, sent warning signals through their trail-hardened instincts. "Maybe you don't know about the Carson gang," Wilson said, taking a step forward. His hand was twitching near his gun, but he hadn't committed to the draw. "We've killed men for less than—" "Gettysburg," Sullivan interrupted, still eerily calm. "Third day of the battle. Confederate cavalry tried to flank our position. I remember the screams of the horses, the way men begged for mercy as we cut them down." His eyes never left them as he spoke, and in their depths Mary saw something that chilled her more than the outlaws' threats. The cold, calculating fury of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and learned its lessons well. "That was the last time I showed mercy in a fight." The outlaws' bravado faltered. They'd bullied plenty of townspeople before, but this was different. This was like standing in front of a loaded cannon, knowing the fuse was already lit. "We'll let Luke know you need some special attention," Tucker muttered, and they backed out of the store, trying to maintain their dignity while their instincts screamed at them to run. As soon as they were gone, Mary turned to thank Sullivan, but he was already moving toward the door. He paused only long enough to say, "Bar your doors tonight, Miss Cooper. Keep the shotgun close." Then he was gone, leaving only the gentle chime of the bell in his wake. Back in the sheriff's office, Colonel Blackwood was still piecing together the story for Wheeler. After Gettysburg, O'Sullivan became something else entirely, the colonel explained, his voice heavy with memory. The mechanical hand they gave him, it wasn't just a replacement limb. It was a weapon designed by the finest minds in the Union Army. They say he could fan the hammer of his revolver faster with those steel fingers than any man alive could with flesh and bone. "And you're certain it's him?" Wheeler asked, watching through the window as Sullivan crossed the street, his cavalry greatcoat rippling in the mountain wind. "Look at how he moves," Blackwood replied. "That's a man who's danced with death so many times they know each other's steps by heart. And if I'm right, Thomas, this town's about to see what happens when the Iron Hand decides to go to war again." Luke Carson had noticed the exchange at the store. He sat straighter in his saddle, studying the quiet rancher with newfound interest. Something about the man's bearing caught his attention, a familiar hint of military bearing that he'd learned never to ignore. "Matthew," he called to his brother, "send a couple boys out to that Davidson ranch tonight. Let's see what our friend's made of." A cruel smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Been a while since we had any real sport in these parts." What Luke Carson didn't realize was that he wasn't looking at prey. He was staring into the eyes of a predator far deadlier than himself, one who had been watching and waiting for exactly this moment. The sun was setting over Thunder Valley, painting the sky in shades of blood red as darkness crept in. The townspeople hurried to their homes, locking doors and windows. They could feel it in their bones. Violence was coming to their quiet town. The peace they'd known was as fragile as autumn frost, about to be shattered by the collision of old ghosts and new demons. The mountain darkness fell thick and heavy over Thunder Valley. broken only by scattered patches of starlight and a thin crescent moon hanging low on the horizon. At the Davidson Ranch, now Sullivan's property, oil lamps burned in the windows of the old two-story house, casting long shadows across the yard where two horses stood saddled and ready. Inside, Michael Sullivan methodically cleaned his Remington revolver, each movement precise and practiced, the mechanical fingers of his right hand working with fluid grace that belied their artificial nature. The weapon had been with him since Gettysburg, a gift from General Meade himself after the battle. Its ivory grip was worn smooth by years of use, and he'd modified the trigger mechanism to work perfectly with his mechanical hand. He'd added a second revolver to his arsenal since then, a Colt Navy conversion carried in a cross-draw holster on his left side. Both weapons were as much a part of him as the mechanical hand that had earned him his legendary status. As he worked, Sullivan's mind drifted back to that fateful day at Gettysburg when a Confederate shell had taken his hand and nearly his life. The Army's engineers had approached him in the field hospital, offering him not just a replacement limb, but a chance to continue serving. The mechanical hand they'd crafted was years ahead of its time, a marvel of brass, steel, and clockwork precision. What they hadn't anticipated was how Sullivan would adapt to it, how he would turn their innovation into something deadly. The sound came just after midnight, the distant crack of a breaking branch followed by the nervous whinny of his horses. Sullivan extinguished the lamps with practiced efficiency, moving through the darkness like he'd learned to do during countless night reconnaissance missions. From his window, he could make out 4 riders approaching through the trees, trying to use the woodland's edge for cover. They were good, he had to admit that, moving in pairs, keeping to the shadows, spreading out to cover all approaches to the house. But good wasn't enough when you were hunting a man who'd spent 2 years tracking rebel raiders through hostile territory. Down in Thunder Valley, Sheriff Wheeler sat in his office with Colonel Blackwood, neither man even pretending to sleep. "Tell me more about his time after Gettysburg," Wheeler said, breaking the long silence. "The official records say he died in 65. Blackwood nodded slowly. "Officially, yes. After Gettysburg, the Army realized they had something unique in O'Sullivan. That mechanical hand of his, it wasn't just a replacement limb, it was a prototype, the only one of its kind. They put him in charge of a special reconnaissance unit, hunting down Confederate guerrilla bands that were targeting Union supply lines. The stories about what he and his men did, some say they were worse than the rebels they hunted. And now we've got him and the Carson gang in the same valley," Wheeler mused. "Lord help us all." Back at the ranch, the first of Luke Carson's men was already learning why they called him Iron Hand. The outlaw never even saw Sullivan, just felt the cold press of mechanical fingers against his neck and heard that whispered voice, "Drop the gun, slow and easy." His partner, 20 feet away, disappeared into the shadows with a muffled grunt. The night seemed to swallow him whole. "How many men at the main camp?" Sullivan asked, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "Go to hell," the outlaw spat. "Been there," Sullivan replied. "Little Round Top, July 2nd, 1863. Now answer the question." Something in his tone made the outlaw's blood run cold. 15, maybe 20. Luke's got men coming in from... He never finished the sentence. Sullivan's mechanical hand connected with precise force, and the man crumpled silently to the ground. Inside the house, the remaining 2 outlaws were discovering that entering a veteran's home was poor strategy. They'd managed to pick the back door's lock only to find the ground floor empty, the furniture arranged to create an elaborate maze of shadows and blind corners that Sullivan had learned to craft during his guerrilla hunting days. "Check upstairs," the leader whispered to his partner. "I'll clear down here." They never saw each other again. The first man made it halfway up the stairs before a floorboard creaked behind him. He spun, gun clearing leather, but the shadow that moved past him was faster. A mechanical hand clamped over his mouth while another trapped his gun hand. The struggle was brief and silent. His partner, searching the kitchen, heard nothing. The moonlight cast strange shadows through the windows, making every corner seem alive with movement. He was a veteran of a dozen raids, but something about this place set his nerves on edge. The silence felt wrong, heavy with menace. A whisper came from everywhere and nowhere. The mechanical hand wasn't meant to be a weapon. The army wanted to give wounded soldiers a chance at a normal life. I'm the one who turned it into something else. The outlaw spun, firing blindly into the shadows. His muzzle flash destroyed his night vision, his last mistake. When they found him the next day, his gun was still smoking, empty shells scattered across the floor. Dawn was still hours away when Luke Carson heard horses approaching their camp. He recognized Tom Wilson's distinctive paint horse through the darkness, but something was wrong. The mount was moving too slow, and there was an extra set of hoofbeats. Jack Carson, half drunk by the campfire, was the first to spot them. "That ain't right," he muttered, reaching for his gun. Two horses emerged from the darkness. Wilson's paint was leading another horse, and tied across both saddles were the 4 men they'd sent to the Davidson ranch. All were unconscious but alive, their weapons gone, their pride wounded more than their bodies. A note was pinned to the lead rider's shirt with uncanny precision. "Next time, send better men, or come yourself." Luke Carson crushed the note in his fist, his face twisted with a rage that had earned him a fearsome reputation across 3 territories. "Matthew," he called to his brother, his voice carrying the chill of a mountain winter, "get some men into town. I want to know everything about this rancher, where he came from, what he's running from, everything." "Already done," Matthew replied, emerging from the shadows like a ghost. He'd always been the thinker among the Carson brothers, the one who planned while Luke executed and Jack unleashed chaos. "Sent Wilson and Tucker to ask around before this mess. They should be back by morning." But morning would bring its own revelations. Colonel Blackwood was already riding east, his urgency carrying him through the dark hours before dawn. He'd seen what was coming, and he knew where he needed to go. There were other veterans out there, men who'd served with Sullivan in that secret unit after Gettysburg. Thunder Valley would need every one of them before this was over. In town, Mary Cooper opened her store to find a small package on her counter, though all her doors and windows were still locked. Inside was a box of ammunition for her shotgun and a simple note in precise military handwriting. "Stay vigilant." And at his ranch, Michael Sullivan watched the sunrise from his porch, counting the hours until the real violence would begin. The 4 men he'd sent back were just a message, a reminder that some soldiers never truly leave the battlefield. But he knew Luke Carson's type. The message wouldn't be enough. The morning brought more than just sunlight to Thunder Valley. It brought whispers, word of the night's events spreading through town like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each telling. By noon, half the town claimed Sullivan had fought off a dozen men without firing a shot, while the other half swore it was closer to 20. Doc Hayes's office had become an impromptu gathering place as he treated the 4 returned raiders. None had life-threatening injuries, but each bore the precise brutality of their encounter: dislocated shoulders, cracked ribs, carefully placed bruises. The kind of damage that spoke of calculated violence rather than blind rage. Matthew Carson stood in the corner of the doctor's office, his cold eyes taking in every detail. Unlike his brothers, Matthew had learned to read men like books, and these injuries told a story he didn't like. Each blow had been precisely placed, designed to incapacitate without killing. This wasn't the work of some lucky rancher. This was professional violence, military precision. "Tell me again," he pressed. "Exactly what happened when you entered the house." The oldest of the 4, a scarred veteran named Phillips, shook his head. It was like trying to fight a shadow, Mr. Carson. The place was rigged, furniture moved to create blind spots, rugs pulled back to make the floorboards creak in certain places. He knew exactly where we'd go, how we'd move. Turned the whole house into a killing ground, except he chose not to kill. At the saloon, Jack Carson was drowning his frustration in whiskey, his anger growing with each drink. "Should have burned the whole damn place down," he growled to no one in particular. "That's what Luke would have done in the old days." A quiet voice behind him made him freeze. "Your brother's smarter than that." Jack turned to find Michael Sullivan standing at the bar, calmly pouring himself a drink. The saloon fell silent, the piano player's fingers hovering motionlessly above the keys. Through his drunken haze, Jack noticed how the mechanical hand moved with unnatural grace as it lifted the glass. "Got some nerve showing your face in town?" Jack snarled, his hand inching toward his gun. His reputation with a six-shooter was well known, but there was something about Sullivan's calm demeanor that made even hardened men nervous. "Just here for supplies," Sullivan replied, sipping his whiskey. "Unless you'd rather continue last night's discussion." The tension in the room was unbearable. Everyone had heard about the night raid by now, and they watched the exchange with a mixture of fear and fascination. Jack Carson's speed with a gun was legendary, but there was something about the way Sullivan stood, something in his military bearing that made the air itself feel like it was waiting for a spark. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Sullivan asked softly. "Your brother Matthew's the thinker. You've always been more the impulsive type." Jack Carson's face twisted with rage. "How do you know what I know all about the Carson gang," Sullivan interrupted, setting his glass down with deliberate care. The mechanical fingers clinked against the glass with a sound like distant artillery. "The bank in Laramie, the massacre at Fort Bridger, the bounties on your heads that keep growing. I even know about that business with the Peterson family last winter, the part that didn't make the wanted posters." Jack's hand had almost reached his gun when a new voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, little brother." Luke Carson stood in the doorway, his presence commanding immediate attention. He walked into the saloon with the confident stride of a man used to owning any room he entered, spurs singing against the wooden floor. Matthew materialized from the shadows near the back door, completing the trio of brothers. "Mr. Sullivan and I need to have a private conversation," Luke continued, his voice carrying the soft menace of a rattlesnake's warning. The other patrons quickly found reasons to be elsewhere, leaving only the Carson brothers, Sullivan, and the trembling bartender who was trying his best to become invisible behind his bar. "Your men need better training," Sullivan remarked, still not turning around. The mechanical hand moved with liquid grace as he raised his glass again. "They make too much noise in the dark." A ghost of a smile played across Luke's features as he pulled up a bar stool, keeping a careful distance. "Seems to me you know a lot about moving in the dark, almost like you've had practice." He studied Sullivan's reflection in the bar mirror, noting the perfect stillness of a trained killer. "I've been asking around about you. Interesting thing, nobody seems to know where you came from. Just appeared one day like a ghost." "Ghosts don't bleed," Sullivan replied quietly. "Everyone bleeds," Luke countered. "Even legends, even the famous Iron Hand of Gettysburg." The name dropped into the silence like a cannon shot. Around the saloon, those few who hadn't managed to escape found themselves instinctively backing away. The Iron Hand wasn't just a legend, he was a nightmare that still haunted Confederate veterans' dreams. "That man died at Cold Harbor," Sullivan said, finally turning to face Luke. Their eyes met across the smoky room, two predators taking each other's measure. "Did he?" Luke's smile widened. "Because I heard a story once about a Union cavalry officer who lost his hand but gained something more dangerous. They say the Army's finest engineers built him a new one, a weapon disguised as a prosthetic. They say he led a special unit after Gettysburg, hunting rebel guerrillas. 33 confirmed kills, All of them clean, professional. No witnesses, no warnings, just bodies left in the dark. Sullivan's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, a cold light that made even Luke Carson pause. "Stay away from my ranch," he said softly. "Stay away from this town. You've got 2 days to ride out. Take your business elsewhere." Luke laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Or what? You'll add us to your count?" Sullivan turned back to his drink. "I'll add you to my nightmares." The threat hung in the air as Sullivan finished his whiskey and walked out of the saloon, past Jack's trembling gun hand and through the gauntlet of Carson men who'd gathered outside. Each of them found themselves avoiding his gaze, their hands strangely reluctant to stray too close to their weapons. Once he was gone, Luke Carson's smile faded. "Matthew," he called to his brother, "send word to all our friends in the territory. I want every gun we can hire. If he wants to play the legendary Iron Hand, we'll give him a proper war." The battle for Thunder Valley was about to begin, and the one-handed veteran had just thrown down the gauntlet. Word traveled fast in the territories, carried on horseback and whispered in saloons. Within 24 hours of Luke Carson's call, hardened gunmen began arriving in Thunder Valley, drawn by the promise of blood money and the chance to test themselves against a legend. Sheriff Wheeler watched them filter in with growing unease. These weren't common outlaws. These were professional killers. He recognized more than a few faces from wanted posters: Apache Jack Martinez from New Mexico, the Keller twins out of Colorado, even the notorious Billy Three Fingers Thompson from Kansas Territory. "They're building an army," Deputy Hayes observed, his young face tight with worry. "Not an army," Wheeler corrected grimly, "a hunting party." But Colonel Blackwood had been busy too. His urgent telegram had reached its destination, a remote ranch in the Dakota Territory, where other veterans of Sullivan's secret unit had found their own kind of peace. The message was simple: the Iron Hand rides again. Thunder Valley, come quick. Back at his ranch, Michael Sullivan was making preparations of his own. Those who rode past reported seeing him methodically working on his property, mending fences, tending cattle, seemingly unconcerned with the gathering storm. But closer observation would have revealed subtle changes: sightlines being cleared, approaches to the house being modified, ammunition being strategically placed. His military training hadn't just taught him how to fight. It had taught him how to prepare a battlefield. Mary Cooper noticed something else when Sullivan came in for supplies: extra coffee, bacon, and ammunition, enough for several men. "Expecting company?" she asked carefully, watching how his mechanical hand sorted the items with military precision. "Old friends," he replied softly, his eyes distant. If Blackwood's message reached them. The way he said it carried the weight of shared battles and spilled blood. In town, Matthew Carson was orchestrating their strategy with cold precision. He'd divided their growing forces into teams, each assigned to specific approaches to Sullivan's ranch. "He's one man, Matthew," told his brothers as they studied a crude map of the property. "No matter how good he is, no matter what kind of mechanical devil's hand he's got, he can't watch every direction at once." Luke nodded, studying the terrain markers they'd drawn. "What about the town?" "Most folks'll stay out of it," Matthew replied. "Sheriff Wheeler's got no deputies to speak of, except that green kid Hayes. Even if he wanted to interfere, he couldn't." Jack Carson, nursing both a hangover and his wounded pride from the saloon encounter, spat on the floor. "Should have killed him right there in the saloon yesterday, and miss all the fun." Luke smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, little brother. When we take down the Iron Hand of Gettysburg, I want it done right. I want stories told about it." As evening approached, Doc Hayes was surprised by a visitor. Sullivan arrived carrying a leather medical bag that looked as old as the war itself. Belonged to the unit surgeon at Cold Harbor, Sullivan explained quietly. I've carried it ever since. Thought you might need it soon. Hayes examined the bag's contents. Surgical instruments, bandages and medicines, all meticulously maintained. You're expecting casualties. I'm expecting war, Sullivan replied, the mechanical fingers of his right hand flexing unconsciously. Best be prepared. The doctor studied his patient-turned-warrior carefully. The men they're bringing in? They're not common thugs. I've treated some of them before. No, Sullivan agreed. They're professionals. Killers. Men who've made their living by the gun. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. But they've never hunted a man who can shoot with iron fingers. At the saloon, the newly arrived gunmen were getting restless. They'd heard the stories about the Iron Hand of Gettysburg, but many dismissed them as tall tales. Billy Three Fingers. Thompson, his missing digits a testament to a life of violence, entertained the crowd with his own theory. I heard he died at Cold Harbor, the gunfighter declared. Shot in the back by his own men when the mechanical hand drove him mad. These stories about him hunting rebels in the dark, fairy tales to scare children and fool cowards. Tell that to the 4 men he sent back last night, someone muttered. Thompson laughed. 4 common raiders surprised in the dark. Tomorrow we'll see how this Iron Hand fares against real killers. But not everyone shared his confidence. Apache Jack Martinez, a veteran of a dozen range wars, sat quietly in the corner, watching and listening. He'd crossed paths with Sullivan's unit once, years ago in New Mexico Territory, had seen firsthand what happened to men who underestimated them. The memories still gave him nightmares. Catherine Davidson, the ranch's previous owner, made her way to Sullivan's property despite the dangers. The widow found him on his porch, mechanical hand methodically cleaning his Remington. My Herbert, she said without preamble. Before he died, he kept a cache of weapons, army supplies from his own war days, hidden in a cave up in the hills. Never told anyone but me about it. Sullivan studied her carefully. Why tell me now? Because I know what's coming, she replied, her eyes carrying the wisdom of a woman who'd seen too much violence. And whatever else you are, Mr. Sullivan, you're a good man. Herbert would have wanted you to have them. Later that night, Sheriff Wheeler made his own visit to the ranch. He found Sullivan working on his mechanical hand by lamplight, making minute adjustments with tools that looked like they'd come straight from the Army's engineering corps. I can't help you officially, Wheeler said. Too many of them, and the laws stretch thin out here. I know. But I can tell you they're planning to move at dawn. Matthew Carson's got them organized in teams. They'll come from all directions, trying to overwhelm you with numbers. Sullivan nodded, never looking up from his work. You should get your deputy out of town tomorrow. Take him on patrol somewhere far from here. Already planned to, Wheeler replied. God help us all, Sullivan, or whatever name you're really using. As the sheriff rode away, other figures were moving in the darkness. Colonel Blackwood's message had reached its mark, and old debts were about to be paid. The Iron Hand wouldn't face tomorrow's storm alone. In town, Luke Carson gathered his killers for final instructions. Tomorrow, they would end the legend of the Iron Hand, but as they plotted and planned, none of them noticed the strange lights up in the hills behind Sullivan's ranch, or the shadowy figures moving through the night, drawn by an old oath and the call of brotherhood forged in blood. Dawn came to Thunder Valley like a held breath, the morning mist clinging to the ground in ghostly tendrils. The sun hadn't yet crested the eastern mountains when Carson's army of killers began moving into position. They spread out in a wide circle around Sullivan's ranch, their movements precise and coordinated under Matthew's careful planning. Apache Jack led the first team approaching from the south, his skill at tracking making him the natural choice for the initial advance. The Keller twins took the eastern approach while Thompson's group crept in from the west. Matthew Carson himself commanded the northern team, with Luke holding a dozen men in reserve, ready to strike wherever an opportunity presented itself. But something was wrong. Thompson felt it first, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the instinct that had kept him alive through countless gunfights. The ranch was too quiet, no movement, no smoke from the chimney, not even a dog's bark. "Hold up," he whispered to his men, the missing fingers on his left hand aching with phantom pain. "Something ain't right." Before anyone could respond, a voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carrying on the morning wind. Last chance to ride away. It was Sullivan's voice, but it seemed to come from multiple directions, making it impossible to pinpoint. Several of the hired guns jumped, their nerves already frayed. "Show yourself, Iron Hand!" Martinez shouted from his position, trying to mask his own unease. "Or are you only brave in the dark?" The answer came in the form of a single shot that seemed to emerge from the mist itself. One of Martinez's men pitched forward, clutching his shoulder, wounded but alive. A warning shot, placed with surgical precision. "That's one," Sullivan's voice drifted through the mist. "I won't aim to wound twice." Luke Carson's voice cut through the tension. "Take him!" The valley erupted in gunfire, bullets whining through the morning air, chewing splinters from the ranch house and surrounding buildings. But return fire came from unexpected quarters. The barn, the corral, positions that shouldn't have been defendable by one man, no matter how legendary. "He's not alone!" Matthew shouted, noticing movement on the ridgeline above the ranch. "Watch the high ground!" He was right. Figures had appeared on the ridgeline, 5 riders, their long cavalry coats marking them as cut from the same cloth. As Sullivan, Colonel Blackwood's message had found its mark. "Who the hell are they?" Jack Carson demanded, watching through his spyglass from the reserve position. Luke's face had gone pale. "The Iron Brigade," he whispered. "The ones who rode with him after Gettysburg, the ones who hunted rebels through the dark." The battle devolved into chaos. The Keller twins' team tried to rush the barn, only to be caught in devastating crossfire. 3 men fell before they could reach cover, their wounds precise but non-lethal. Martinez's group made it to the corral, but found themselves pinned down by accurate fire from multiple directions. Billy Thompson had seen enough. "Fall back!" he shouted to his men, his missing fingers forgotten in the rush of fear. "It's a killing ground." But retreat wasn't as simple as advancing had been. Every route of escape seemed covered. Every movement drew fire. The Iron Hand of Gettysburg had turned his entire ranch into an elaborate trap, using the terrain and pre-positioned defenses to maximum effect. His mechanical hand never seemed to tire, each shot finding its mark with inhuman precision. Matthew Carson watched his careful plan unravel through gritted teeth. "Push forward!" he commanded. "We still have the numbers." A quiet voice behind him made his blood run cold. "Numbers don't matter in the dark, Matthew." He spun, drawing his gun, but Sullivan was faster. Matthew found himself staring down the barrel of that legendary Remington, his own weapon clattering to the ground. 8 years, Sullivan said softly to the captured Matthew Carson, his mechanical hand never wavering. 8 years I've waited to meet men like you. Men who think their numbers make them invincible. Men who prey on the weak because they've never faced true strength. The morning mist swirled around them like ghostly spectators to this deadly reunion. Up on the ridge, the Iron Brigade was systematically dismantling Carson's carefully planned assault. These weren't just any veterans, they were the elite of the elite, men who'd followed Sullivan through the darkest days after Gettysburg. Captain James Hawkeye Reynolds, whose rifle accuracy had become legendary in the Shenandoah Valley. Sergeant William Shadow Martinez, who could move through enemy lines like a ghost. Lieutenant Thomas Engineer Cooper, whose tactical innovations had revolutionized their night operations. Each man had been handpicked by Sullivan. Each had been transformed by the crucible of that secret war. Iron Hand, we've got movement. On the east flank. Reynolds's voice carried clear and precise through the morning air, using the battlefield communications they'd perfected years ago. The mechanical clicking of Sullivan's hand as he adjusted his grip on his Remington seemed to echo the mechanical precision of their coordinated defense. Luke Carson, watching the disaster unfold from his reserve position, finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. "Wade," he shouted to his youngest brother, "get our reserves up there, surround the house." But Wade Carson never got the chance to relay that order. A bullet kicked up dust at his feet, followed by a familiar whisper in the wind, "The boy stays out of this." The morning mist was beginning to burn off, revealing the true extent of the battlefield. Bodies lay scattered across the ranch yard, some groaning, others ominously still. Doc Hayes, watching from the edge of town through his field glasses, could already tell it would be a long day. The precision of the wounds told its own story. These weren't the wild shots of common gunmen, but the calculated work of military professionals. Apache Jack Martinez, his previous bravado forgotten, tried to rally his remaining men. "He's still just one man," he shouted, but the words died in his throat as Sullivan seemed to materialize from the shadows behind their position. The legendary veteran moved like smoke, his black cavalry coat making him seem part of the darkness itself. Two of Martinez's men reached for their guns. Both were on the ground before their hands found steel. "Just one man?" Sullivan said quietly. "That was always your kind's mistake, thinking you were hunting a man." His mechanical hand caught the morning light, the brass and steel mechanisms moving with deadly grace. "You're hunting a weapon, one forged at Gettysburg, tempered in the dark days that followed, and perfected in the shadows of 1,000 nights, like this one." Up at the main house, Luke Carson was finally beginning to understand the true gravity of his mistake. He'd brought an army to kill a legend, only to find that legends sometimes travel in packs. The Iron Brigade moved through his men with practiced efficiency, each veteran displaying the same deadly precision as Sullivan himself. Billy Thompson, perhaps the only one among them who had truly understood what they were facing, threw down his gun belt. "I'm done," he announced. "Any man with sense would be." The morning was not yet half over, and already the legend of the Iron Hand was growing. But for Michael Sullivan, this was only the beginning. Matthew Carson was securely bound, but Luke was still out there, rallying his remaining men. "Didn't expect to see you all here," Sullivan said to Reynolds as they regrouped behind the barn's cover. The veteran sniper checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Couldn't let you face this alone," Reynolds replied. "Not after what we went through together." His hand unconsciously touched an old scar on his neck. "We all came, every one of us who rode in the dark with you back then." In town, Luke Carson was regrouping his remaining forces. More than half his men were dead, wounded, or had simply fled after witnessing the morning's carnage. Matthew was captured, and Wade was growing increasingly unstable, his fear masked by false bravado and whiskey. "Send word to every camp and hide out within riding distance," Luke ordered one of his remaining lieutenants. "Promise them whatever they want. I need more guns here by nightfall." "They won't come," a quiet voice said. Everyone turned to see Billy Thompson walking into the saloon, his gun belt conspicuously absent. Words already spreading about what happened this morning. "No one's going to ride against the Iron Brigade, not for any price." Luke's face twisted with rage. "They're just men." "No," Thompson replied, pouring himself a drink with shaking hands. "There's something else out there, something that should have stayed buried in the past, something born in the blood of Gettysburg and forged in the shadows of a war most of us have tried to forget." At the sheriff's office, Colonel Blackwood was getting the full story from Reynolds as they watched Luke Carson's men retreat to regroup. "After Gettysburg, the veteran sniper explained, his voice heavy with memory. Sullivan didn't just train us to fight. He created something entirely new. The mechanical hand they gave him, it wasn't just about replacing what he'd lost. It was about showing us all that our wounds, our scars, they could make us stronger. The Iron Brigade, Wheeler said, testing the words. I'd heard whispers, but I always thought they were just stories. We were more than a unit, Reynolds continued, checking his rifle with practiced ease. Sullivan taught us to move like shadows, to strike with surgical precision. The regular army wanted brute force, but he showed us that true strength lies in control. Every shot placed exactly where it needs to be, every move calculated to minimize bloodshed while maximizing effect. Outside, Doc Hayes and Mary Cooper had transformed the general store's basement into a makeshift hospital. The wounded from the morning's battle filled every available space, their injuries telling a story of ruthless efficiency. Notice anything strange about the wounds? Hayes asked Mary as they worked. She nodded, having assisted with enough patience to see the pattern. They're all survivable, painful, incapacitating, but none of them fatal. Even in the heat of battle, they maintained that level of control. Back at the ranch, Sullivan was interrogating Matthew Carson while his old comrades secured the perimeter. The mechanical hand clicked softly as he adjusted the bindings, each movement precise and deliberate. You're going to tell me everything about your brother's operation, he said quietly. Every hideout, every ally, every plan. Matthew spat defiantly. Go to hell. I've been there, Sullivan replied, the mechanical fingers flexing. Gettysburg, July 3rd, 1863. Watched half my unit die holding the line against Pickett's charge. Lost my hand to a Confederate shell, but gained something far more valuable. Purpose. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Your brother's gonna come for you. When he does, I want him to understand exactly what he's walking into. Lieutenant Cooper approached, his engineer's mind already analyzing the ranch's defenses. Luke Carson won't wait long, he observed. He's lost too much face already. He'll try something desperate. Sullivan nodded. That's what I'm counting on. Send word to the others. I want every approach covered, every angle watched. Luke Carson's about to learn why they called us the Iron Brigade. In town, Luke Carson was indeed planning something desperate. His remaining men had gathered in the back room of the saloon, their faces showing a mixture of fear and determination. I've got men bringing in dynamite, he announced, enough to level that whole damn ranch. If we can't outshoot them, we'll bury them. Billy Thompson, still nursing his drink at the bar, shook his head. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Luke. I knew a man once, down in Texas, tried something similar against Sullivan's unit during the war. They found him 3 days later, still alive, wishing he wasn't. The Iron Hand doesn't just kill you, he makes you regret ever thinking you could stand against him. But Luke was beyond reason now. The capture of his brother, the decimation of his forces, the damage to his reputation. It had pushed him past the point of rational thought. Get the word out, he ordered his remaining lieutenants. Double pay for anyone who joins us tonight. Triple for anyone who brings explosives or heavy weapons. The town won't stand for that kind of destruction, Wade protested, showing a rare moment of clarity through his whiskey haze. Luke's laugh was hollow. The town. Look around, little brother. After what happened this morning, do you think anyone in this town will dare stand against us? They'll hide in their homes and thank their lucky stars we're not turning our attention to them instead. But he had underestimated the changes that morning's battle had brought to Thunder Valley. Mary Cooper was quietly organizing the townspeople, distributing weapons and ammunition that had mysteriously appeared in her store's basement. Sheriff Wheeler, though maintaining official neutrality, had positioned his deputy and several trusted citizens at key points throughout the town. The Iron Brigade's stand had shown them something they'd forgotten, that even the most fearsome predators could be resisted if people stood together. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Sullivan gathered his old comrades in the ranch house. Each man checked his weapons with practiced efficiency, the habits of their wartime service coming back as naturally as breathing. "Luke Carson's the type to burn everything rather than admit defeat," Sullivan observed, his mechanical hand moving with fluid grace as he cleaned his Remington. "He'll come at us with everything he has left." "Just like old times," Shadow Martinez grinned, the first real smile anyone had seen from him since their reunion. "The Iron Brigade, making our stand against impossible odds." "Nothing's impossible," Sullivan replied softly, watching the sun paint the valley in shades of blood red. "Not for men who've already died once and come back stronger." His mechanical fingers clicked against his gun's hammer, a sound like destiny counting down to 0 hour. Night settled over Thunder Valley like a burial shroud, broken only by scattered patches of starlight and the occasional flicker of lanterns from Sullivan's ranch. In town, Luke Carson's desperation had taken on a dangerous edge as he gathered his remaining forces. The explosives he'd promised had arrived, enough dynamite to turn the entire ranch into a smoking crater. His men worked by lamplight in the livery stable, preparing charges and planning their approach. Matthew Carson, still bound in Sullivan's barn, watched through a window as the Iron Brigade made their preparations. Their efficiency was haunting, each man moving with precise purpose, setting up fields of fire and preparing fallback positions, with the expertise that came from years of warfare. But it was their quiet conversations that truly chilled him, the way they communicated with minimal words, like parts of a well-oiled machine. "Your brother's bringing in explosives," Sullivan said quietly, approaching Matthew's position. The mechanical hand gleamed dully in the lantern light as he checked the prisoner's bonds. "He's always been predictable that way. When brute force fails, he turns to destruction." "You don't know Luke," Matthew replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "You don't know what he's capable of." "I know exactly what he's capable of." Sullivan's voice carried the weight of countless battles. "Men like your brother, they think violence is about force, about who can bring the most guns or the biggest explosion. They never learned what the war taught us, that true violence is about precision, about control." He flexed his mechanical fingers, the brass and steel components moving with uncanny grace, about turning your wounds into weapons. Outside, Lieutenant Cooper was setting up elaborate tripwires and alarm systems around the property's perimeter. His engineering background had made him the Iron Brigade's expert in defensive preparations. "Just like Sharpsburg," he called out to Sullivan. "Remember how we rigged the whole valley that night?" "Difference is," Shadow Martinez added from his position in the barn's loft, "this time we're not hunting rebels in the dark. We're standing our ground." Captain Reynolds, returning from a scouting mission, brought news that made everyone's blood run cold. "They've got enough dynamite to level a mountain," he reported, his sniper's eyes having caught every detail of Carson's preparations. "They're planning to hit us from all sides, use the explosives to drive us into their gun line." Sullivan absorbed this information with characteristic calm. "They're thinking like soldiers now," he observed. "Pity they never learned that soldiers don't always win wars. Sometimes it takes ghosts." He turned to his old comrades, his voice taking on the command tone they remembered from countless night operations. "Cooper, I want every approach mined, not to kill, but to channel them where we want them. Martinez, you and Reynolds set up crossfire positions here and here. When they come, we'll give them a lesson in why they called us the Iron Brigade." In town, Mary Cooper was organizing her own form of resistance. The townspeople had spent the day moving supplies into root cellars and basement strongrooms, preparing for what everyone knew would be a night of violence. "Sullivan and his men won't just be fighting for themselves," she told the gathered citizens. They'll be fighting for all of us, for every town that's ever been terrorized by men like the Carsons." Doc Hayes had converted his entire clinic into a field hospital, drawing on his experiences treating battlefield wounds during the war. "Whatever happens tonight," he told his son Jimmy, who had refused to leave town despite his father's pleading, "remember what Sullivan showed us, that one man standing up to evil can inspire others to find their courage." Sheriff Wheeler, though unable to officially take sides, had positioned himself strategically. "If Carson's men start using explosives," he told his deputy, "all bets are off. The law may be stretched thin out here, but some lines can't be crossed." Luke Carson, watching the sunset paint the valley blood-red, was past caring about lines or laws. His reputation lay in ruins, his brother was captive, and half his men had deserted after the morning's disaster. "When this is over," he swore to his remaining lieutenants, "I want that whole valley burned. Let them tell stories about that." But other stories were already spreading, whispered in saloons and around campfires. Tales of the Iron Brigade's return, of the mechanical-handed veteran who'd turned his wounds into weapons, of how a quiet rancher had revealed himself to be something far more dangerous. Some said Sullivan had made a deal with the devil at Gettysburg, trading his flesh and blood hand for one of brass and steel that never tired, never missed. Others claimed the Iron Brigade weren't men at all, but ghosts, spirits of vengeance, drawn back to the world of the living by the sound of Sullivan's mechanical fingers clicking against his gun's trigger. As full darkness settled over Thunder Valley, Sullivan stood on his porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. The mechanical hand moved with liquid grace as he checked his Remington one final time. Behind him, the Iron Brigade made their final preparations, each man knowing that dawn would either see them triumphant or dead. There would be no middle ground, no retreat, no surrender. The war they'd thought ended at Appomattox was about to see one final battle, and Thunder Valley would never be the same. Midnight brought an unnatural silence to Thunder Valley, broken only by the soft whisper of the wind through the prairie grass. Luke Carson's men moved through the darkness with exaggerated care, each man carrying enough dynamite to level a building. They'd abandoned any pretense of stealth, knowing that Sullivan's crew would be watching. This wasn't about surprise anymore. It was about overwhelming force. Inside the ranch house, Sullivan stood in darkness, his mechanical hand moving with precise, controlled motions as he made final adjustments to the trigger mechanism. The brass and steel components caught what little moonlight filtered through the windows, creating an almost ethereal effect. Lieutenant Cooper watched from nearby, his engineer's mind appreciating the intricate craftsmanship of the prosthetic. "Never did ask you," Cooper said softly. "How many variations did they make before they got it right?" Sullivan's voice was barely a whisper. 17, each one more complex than the last. The Army's finest engineers worked for months, trying to create something that could match the precision of flesh and bone. The mechanical fingers clicked softly as he flexed them. "They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Gave me something better than what I lost." From his position in the barn's hayloft, Shadow Martinez spotted the first movement. "North slope," he reported, using the hand signals they'd developed during the war. "At least 10 men, carrying charges." Captain Reynolds, positioned in the windmill tower with his specialized long-range rifle, confirmed the sighting. 2 more groups approaching from the east and west. Luke Carson's with the eastern group. He paused, adjusting his scope. "They're not even trying to hide the dynamite anymore." "Pride," Sullivan replied, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that had led them through countless night operations. Luke Carson's pride won't let him back down, won't let him consider that he might be overmatched. It's what made him predictable in the end. The first explosion came without warning, a thunderous blast that shook the very foundations of the ranch house. But Sullivan and his men were ready. They'd anticipated Carson's strategy, known that he would try to force them into the open with explosives. What Carson hadn't realized was that every blast was actually channeling his men exactly where the Iron Brigade wanted them. Like herding cattle, Cooper observed from his position, watching Carson's men unknowingly follow the paths they'd prepared. Each explosion pushed them further into the elaborate web of crossfire zones and tactical choke points that the brigade had established. In town, the explosion sent the civilians scrambling for their prepared shelters. Doc Hayes stood ready in his clinic, knowing that dawn would bring casualties. Mary Cooper, watching from her store's second floor, saw the flashes of dynamite painting the night sky in brutal colors. Sheriff Wheeler and his deputy maintained their vigil, weapons ready, knowing that some of the violence might spill into the town itself. Luke Carson, directing the assault from what he thought was a safe distance, felt his confidence growing with each explosion. "See how they hide," he shouted to his men, "the mighty Iron Brigade, cowering in the dark." His voice carried the edge of madness now, the desperation of a man who'd staked everything on one final gambit. What he didn't realize was that Sullivan's men weren't hiding at all. They were moving, silent as ghosts, taking up pre-planned positions that would turn the entire ranch into one massive trap. The Iron Brigade hadn't survived the war by meeting force with force. They'd survived by turning their enemy's strength against them. Matthew Carson, still bound in the barn, watched through gaps in the walls as the battle unfolded. He'd seen plenty of violence in his life, had planned more than his share of tactical assaults. But this was different. This was warfare elevated to an art form, every movement coordinated with mechanical precision. "You're going to get them all killed," he said as Sullivan passed by his position. Sullivan paused, the mechanical hand gleaming in a flash of explosive light from outside. "No," he replied softly. "I'm going to teach them why the army called us the Iron Brigade, why the Confederates called us the Ghost Legion, why even the most hardened veterans learned to fear the sound of mechanical fingers on a trigger." Another explosion rocked the night, closer this time, and Sullivan's voice took on an edge that made Matthew's blood run cold. "Your brother thinks he's fighting men. He never learned what the war taught us, that sometimes men become something else, something harder, something that remembers every wound, every scar, every moment of pain, and turns them into weapons sharper than any blade." The mechanical hand moved with liquid grace as Sullivan checked his Remington one final time. Tonight, Luke Carson learns what real warfare looks like. What happens when you push honorable men too far, when you force them to remember skills they'd hoped to forget. He turned to his old comrades, each man positioned and ready. "Iron Brigade! Show them why they still tell stories about us around campfires. Show them why some legends are best left undisturbed." The night erupted into carefully orchestrated chaos. Carson's men, emboldened by the destructive power of their explosives, pressed forward into what they thought was their advantage. They didn't realize they were walking into one of the most sophisticated military traps ever conceived in the Western Territories. Sullivan's voice carried across the battlefield with parade ground clarity, each command precisely timed. "Cooper, initiate sequence 1. The mechanical hand moved with fluid grace as he positioned himself at the heart of their defensive strategy. Lieutenant Cooper pulled a series of carefully prepared triggers, and suddenly the battlefield transformed. The Iron Brigade had spent their preparation time doing more than just setting up firing positions. They had engineered the entire landscape into a weapon. Predetermined zones became instant quagmires as Cooper's system of dammed irrigation channels released their contents. The explosives Carson's men carried became dead weight, slowing them down in the treacherous footing. Like Chancellorsville, "In reverse," Reynolds called from his elevated position, his sniper's eye catching every detail of their plan's execution. He began picking off the dynamite carriers with surgical precision, his shots calculated to wound rather than kill, creating chaos in the attacking force's ranks. Luke Carson, watching his assault bog down, felt the first real stirrings of fear. His men were no longer attacking, they were floundering, caught in a web of tactical precision that seemed to anticipate their every move. "Push forward," he commanded, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. "They're just 5 men. Wrong." Sullivan's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, a trick of acoustics they'd perfected during their guerrilla campaign. "We're not just men. We're what the war created when it pushed good men too far. When it took our humanity and replaced it with steel and strategy." The mechanical hand clicked in the darkness, the sound carrying like the rattling of chains. "Iron Brigade, execute pattern Delta." Shadow Martinez emerged from his concealed position like his namesake, moving through Carson's lines with ghost-like efficiency. 2 men went down before they realized he was there, their weapons disabled with precise strikes. "Just like old times, Captain," he called to Sullivan, using their old battlefield shorthand. "These boys never learned to watch their flanks." The explosions continued, but now they worked against Carson's men. Each blast illuminated the battlefield at exactly the wrong moment, destroying their night vision and exposing their positions. The Iron Brigade, trained to fight in darkness, used these moments of blindness to devastating effect. "You don't understand what you're facing," Sullivan's voice carried across the chaos, the mechanical hand gleaming in the explosive flashes. "The army didn't just give me a new hand. They gave me a symbol of what men become when war strips away everything but purpose. Every gear, every spring, every brass plate is a lesson in transformation." Cooper's voice cut through the night. "Second sequence ready, Iron Hand." The use of Sullivan's old battlefield title carried weight, reminding everyone that this wasn't just a rancher defending his property. This was a legendary military unit showing why they had earned their fearsome reputation. Luke Carson, watching another group of his men retreat from Martinez's shadowy advances, made a critical error. "Concentrate the charges," he shouted. "Level the whole damn ranch." His desperation had overwhelmed his tactical judgment, exactly as Sullivan had predicted. "Now you understand," Sullivan's voice carried an almost pitying tone. "Your brother tried to warn you. Some legends aren't just stories. Some wounds don't just heal. They evolve. They become something else entirely." The mechanical hand moved, with pristine grace, as he signaled the next phase of their defense. "Iron Brigade, show them what that means." The coordinated response was devastating in its precision. Reynolds' rifle spoke from the elevated position, disabling the primary. Charges before Carson's men could set them. Cooper's engineering turned their own explosions against them, the carefully prepared ground channeling the force back toward the attackers. Martinez emerged from the darkness at crucial moments, a living shadow that seemed to anticipate every attempted rally. In town, Doc Hayes heard the pattern of gunfire change. As a veteran himself, he recognized what was happening. "That's not a battle anymore," he told his son. "That's a military operation, the difference between brawlers and soldiers." Mary Cooper, still watching from her vantage point, saw it too. Each explosion, each shot, each movement was purposeful. The Iron Brigade wasn't just fighting, they were conducting a symphony of precise violence, with Sullivan's mechanical hand keeping time like a conductor's baton. Luke Carson's world had devolved into a nightmare of precision and planning, where every shadow concealed a potential death sentence, and every explosion revealed the devastating efficiency of his opponents. The battlefield that he'd thought would be his triumph had become a carefully orchestrated trap, with each blast of dynamite serving only to illuminate the fatal flaws in his strategy. His men, those who still remained, had lost their earlier bravado, moving like hunted things through terrain that seemed to have turned against them. "Fall back to position 3!" Carson shouted, his voice carrying the edge of growing panic. Across the fire-lit darkness. But even retreat had become a deadly gamble. The Iron Brigade had systematically cut off their predetermined fallback positions, turning the entire valley into a calculated maze of death and disability. Each route they tried led them deeper into the brigade's web of crossfire zones and tactical choke points. Sullivan's voice drifted through the darkness, accompanied by the distinctive click of his mechanical hand cycling another round. The sound carried across the battlefield like the ticking of some great and terrible clock, counting down to judgment. Your men are learning, Luke. Learning what Confederate raiders learned at Gettysburg, what guerrilla bands learned in the Shenandoah. Some enemies can't be beaten with brute force. Some lessons can only be written in blood and gunpowder. From his position in the converted barn, Matthew Carson watched the systematic dismantling of his brother's forces with a tactician's unwilling admiration. Every move, every shot, every explosion was part of a larger strategy that he was only now beginning to comprehend. The Iron Brigade wasn't just fighting. They were conducting a military operation with clockwork precision, each man moving like a perfectly calibrated component in a vast and deadly machine. Lieutenant Cooper's voice cut through the chaos with parade ground clarity. Third sequence engaged, Iron Hand. The use of Sullivan's war name carried weight, transforming him from a rancher defending his property into something else entirely. A military commander orchestrating a symphony of precise violence. The mechanical hand gleamed in the firelight as Sullivan signaled the next phase of their defense, each motion precise and purposeful. The sequence unfolded with mechanical grace. Hidden charges that Cooper had planted during their preparations detonated in careful succession, not to kill, but to drive Carson's men exactly where the brigade wanted them. Reynolds's rifle spoke from multiple positions, creating the illusion of a much larger force, each shot placed with surgical precision to wound rather than kill. Shadow Martinez seemed to materialize from the darkness itself, striking with the efficiency of a ghost before melting away into the night. "You still don't understand what you're facing," Sullivan's voice carried across the battlefield, calm and measured despite the chaos. "The war didn't just take my hand. It forged something new, something that remembers every lesson written in blood at Antietam, at Chancellorsville, at Gettysburg." The mechanical hand gleamed in the explosive flashes, its brass and steel components, moving with inhuman precision. Each piece of this hand represents a different kind of loss, a different kind of strength. The brass fingers that never tire, the steel joints that never weaken, the mechanical precision that never fails. They're all reminders that some men don't just survive their wounds, they transform them. Luke Carson, watching another group of his men retreat in disarray, their weapons abandoned in their haste to escape Martinez's shadowy advances, made a final, fatal mistake. "Bring up the heavy charges!" he commanded, his voice cracking with desperation. "All of them! We'll bury them all!" "Now you prove you've learned nothing." Sullivan's voice carried an almost sorrowful tone. "Your brother tried to warn you about precision, about control. Some legends aren't born from victory, Luke. They're born from understanding that true strength lies in restraint, in knowing exactly how much force to apply and when to apply it." The mechanical hand moved in a complex series of signals, each motion precise and purposeful. Iron Brigade, execute pattern Omega. The response was immediate and devastating. Each member of the brigade moved with perfect coordination, as if the years since the war had never passed. They had drilled these maneuvers countless times during their guerrilla campaign, perfecting them against Confederate raiders who'd thought superior numbers guaranteed victory. Reynolds's rifle spoke from the darkness, disabling the heavy charges before Carson's men could position them. Cooper's engineering turned their own explosions against them, the carefully prepared ground channeling the force away from vital structures and back toward the attackers. In town, Sheriff Wheeler watched the unfolding battle with growing amazement, the night sky periodically illuminated by carefully controlled detonations. "I've seen a lot of fighting in my time," he told his deputy, his voice carrying a mix of awe and professional appreciation, "but nothing like this. This isn't random violence, this is military precision applied to personal combat. We're watching history being made tonight, son. A demonstration of why some legends deserve their reputation." Mary Cooper, maintaining her vigil at the store window, witnessed the battle's transformation into something beyond mere violence. Each explosion now served the brigade's purpose, every shot placed with calculated effect. The chaos of battle had been transformed into something else entirely, a demonstration of how military precision could overcome brute force. The night sky above Thunder Valley had become a canvas painted with precise bursts of light, each flash revealing another phase of Sullivan's elaborate strategy. Luke Carson's remaining men began to waver, their confidence shattered by the realization that they weren't facing a typical rancher's defense, but something far more sophisticated. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to work against them, every path they took leading them deeper into the brigade's carefully prepared killing ground. The mechanical perfection of their opponent's coordination had stripped away any illusion that superior numbers would guarantee victory. "Iron Brigade, execute final containment," Sullivan's voice carried across the battlefield with calm authority. The mechanical hand moved through a series of precise gestures, each motion triggering a coordinated response from his veteran compatriots. Lieutenant Cooper's voice acknowledged from his position, "Charges set, Iron Hand, awaiting your command." The mechanical fingers clicked against Sullivan's Remington, a sound that had become synonymous with impending judgment. "Luke Carson," he called out, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that had once directed cavalry charges at Gettysburg. "You've lost 17 men tonight. None dead, all disabled with surgical precision. Would you like to know why?" Carson's response was a desperate volley of gunfire, his shots going wide in the darkness. Sullivan continued as if the interruption hadn't occurred, his mechanical hand gleaming in the sporadic light of distant explosions. "Because this isn't about killing, it's about teaching, about showing men like you that violence isn't about who can cause the most destruction. It's about control, precision, and understanding the weight of every action." From his elevated position, Reynolds called down in their battlefield shorthand, "Perimeter secured, Iron Hand. Final phase ready." His rifle remained trained on Carson's position, the scope reflecting occasional flashes of explosions in the distance. Shadow Martinez materialized briefly from the darkness to confirm, "Western approach contained. They're running out of options." Luke Carson felt the noose tightening, his tactical mind finally grasping the full scope of what he'd walked into. This wasn't just a defense. It was a military operation planned with clockwork precision. The Iron Brigade had turned his own aggressive strategy against him, using his reliance on explosives and overwhelming force to manipulate his men's movements exactly as they'd intended. "Your brother understands now," Sullivan's voice came again, closer this time. "He's watched us demonstrate what real military precision looks like. The difference between thugs with dynamite and soldiers with purpose." The mechanical hand emerged from the darkness first, its brass and steel components moving with fluid grace as Sullivan stepped into view. "Last chance, Luke. Surrender, face justice, or learn firsthand why the Confederacy feared the sound of mechanical fingers on a trigger." In the barn, Matthew Carson watched the final phase of the operation unfold with a tactician's appreciation. Each member of the Iron Brigade had positioned themselves perfectly, creating an interlocking web of fields of fire that left his brother nowhere to go. The precision of their movements, the way they anticipated each other's actions without need for verbal communication, spoke of years of battlefield experience and countless operations conducted in perfect synchronization. "You're all ghosts," Luke shouted into the darkness, his voice carrying the edge of madness. "Dead men playing at war." He raised his rifle, targeting Sullivan's silhouette. "Let's see if that mechanical hand can stop a bullet." The shot echoed across Thunder Valley, but Sullivan hadn't moved. Instead, the mechanical hand rose slowly, holding the bullet that Carson had fired. The brass fingers had plucked it from the air with impossible precision, a demonstration of capability that silenced every man on the battlefield. "No," Sullivan said quietly, letting the bullet fall to the ground with a soft ping. "Not ghosts. Something far more dangerous. Men who learned that every wound, every scar, every loss can become a weapon if you apply enough precision." The mechanical hand moved in one final series of signals, and the Iron Brigade responded with perfect coordination. Cooper's carefully placed charges detonated in sequence, not to kill, but to contain, creating a ring of controlled explosions that sealed off Carson's last avenue of escape. Reynolds' rifle spoke once, twice, 3 times, each shot disabling one of Carson's remaining lieutenants with surgical accuracy. Martinez emerged from the shadows behind Carson himself, as silent and inevitable as judgment. "The war taught us that victory doesn't belong to the side with the most men or the biggest explosions," Sullivan continued, the mechanical hand moving with liquid grace as he approached Carson's position. "It belongs to those who understand that true strength lies in precision, in control, in knowing exactly how much force to apply and when to apply it. Tonight, you learned what the Confederacy learned at Gettysburg, that some legends are earned through more than just violence." Luke Carson stood frozen in disbelief, the demonstration of the mechanical hand's capabilities having shattered his last vestiges of confidence. Around him, the carefully orchestrated containment of the Iron Brigade had eliminated every possible escape route. The night air carried the acrid scent of expended gunpowder and the metallic click of Sullivan's mechanical fingers adjusting their grip on his Remington. "The Army's engineers didn't just give me a replacement hand," Sullivan explained, his voice carrying the weight of years of combat experience. "They gave me a reminder that destruction isn't the highest form of warfare. Precision is." The brass and steel components caught the light of the dying fires as he approached Carson's position. Each component was designed to exceed human limitations, not just in strength, but in control. Every gear, every spring, every mechanical movement represents a lesson learned in blood. From their strategic positions around the battlefield, the other members of the Iron Brigade maintained their disciplined focus. Reynolds kept his rifle trained on the remaining targets, each shot carefully calculated to disable rather than kill. Cooper monitored his network of engineering innovations that had transformed the ranch into an elaborate tactical apparatus. Martinez moved like a shadow through the remaining pockets of resistance, systematically disarming Carson's few remaining men. "Your reputation preceded you, Luke," Sullivan continued, the mechanical hand moving with fluid grace as he gestured toward the surrounding carnage. "The man who burned his way across 3 territories, who thought fear and destruction were the ultimate weapons. But fear is imprecise. Destruction is wasteful. True power lies in control." He turned to survey the battlefield, where every casualty had been inflicted with surgical accuracy. Every explosion had served a specific tactical purpose. In town, Dr. Hayes had begun receiving the wounded from Carson's forces. Each injury told the same story: precise wounds designed to incapacitate without killing, placed with mechanical accuracy that spoke of extensive military training. "In all my years of medicine," he remarked to Mary Cooper as they tended to the casualties, "I've never seen such controlled violence. It's like they turned warfare into a science." Sheriff Wheeler, watching from the edge of town with his deputy, understood the full significance of what they were witnessing. "This isn't just about one rancher defending his property," he explained to the young lawman. "This is about the difference between brutality and precision, between chaos and control. Sullivan and his Iron Brigade aren't just fighting, they're teaching a lesson that'll be remembered in these territories for generations." Matthew Carson, still secured in the barn, watched through the gaps in the walls as his brother's criminal empire crumbled under the weight of military precision. The tactical genius of Sullivan's strategy had transformed what should have been a straightforward assault into a masterclass in defensive warfare. Every move the Iron Brigade had made served multiple purposes: herding their opponents, controlling the battlefield, and systematically eliminating options until only surrender remained. "Your men are defeated, Luke," Sullivan's voice carried across the now quiet battlefield, "not through superior numbers or overwhelming force, but through precision and control. The same precision that let us track Confederate raiders through the Shenandoah Valley. The same control that kept us alive when we were outnumbered 10-1 at Gettysburg." The mechanical hand moved with liquid grace as he holstered his Remington. "The same lessons I've been trying to teach you since this began." Luke Carson, his previous bravado stripped away by the night's events, finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. He had brought an army of thugs against a military unit that had helped win the bloodiest war in American history, had tried to counter precision with chaos, expertise with brute force. The results lay scattered across the battlefield, his men, wounded but alive, his strategy in ruins, his reputation shattered. "The war changed us all," Sullivan continued, the mechanical fingers clicking softly as he gestured for Martinez to secure Carson. "Some men came home broken, others came home hardened, but a few of us came home transformed. We learned that every loss, every wound, every scar could become an advantage if approached with the right mindset. This hand isn't just a replacement for what I lost, it's a symbol of that transformation." The first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, revealing the full extent of the Iron Brigade's victory. The battlefield had been transformed into a testament to military precision, where every piece of cover, every angle of fire, every explosive charge had served a specific purpose in their intricate strategy. Carson's men, those who remained conscious, were being systematically disarmed and secured, their wounds treated with the same precision that had inflicted them. As dawn fully illuminated Thunder Valley, the true masterpiece of Sullivan's strategy revealed itself in stark detail. The battlefield told a story not of chaos and destruction, but of calculated precision and tactical brilliance that would be studied and discussed in saloons and military academies for years to come. Every position had been carefully chosen with veteran insight, every shot placed with surgical accuracy that spoke of years of battlefield experience, every explosion coordinated to serve a specific purpose in their grand design. The Iron Brigade had transformed warfare into an art form, where victory came not through overwhelming force, but through perfect control and mechanical precision. Sullivan stood on the rise overlooking the transformed valley, his mechanical hand moving with fluid grace as he surveyed their night's work. The morning sun caught the brass and steel components of his prosthetic, making them gleam like the badges of authority they had become. Each mechanism, each gear, each precisely machined component reflected not just the army engineer's genius, but the evolution of warfare itself, from brute force to calculated efficiency, from destruction to precision. "Look around you," he instructed the assembled prisoners, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that had once commanded cavalry charges at Gettysburg. "Every man here is alive, though none of you deserved such mercy. Every wound was placed exactly where we intended, every movement controlled with mechanical precision. This wasn't just a victory, it was a demonstration of the difference between power and precision, between chaos and control." Lieutenant Cooper emerged from his final inspection of the elaborate defensive systems they'd created, his engineer's mind still appreciating the intricate network of interconnected mechanisms that had transformed the ranch into a tactical masterpiece. "All charges secured, Iron Hand," he reported, falling naturally into their old military protocol. "The engineering worked exactly as planned. Every explosion served its purpose. Every trap functioned with mechanical precision." He paused, studying the complex web of tripwires and pressure plates that had channeled Carson's men exactly where the brigade had wanted them. "Just like the old days in the Shenandoah, though we've refined the techniques considerably since then." Sheriff Wheeler arrived with his deputy and several trusted townsmen to take custody of the prisoners, each lawman's eyes widening as they took in the full scope of the night's events. The battlefield before them demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that went beyond anything they'd seen in their years of law enforcement. "In 20 years of wearing this badge," Wheeler remarked to Sullivan, "I've never seen anything like this. You didn't just defeat them, you dismantled them with military precision that turned their own tactics against them. Every man wounded, but alive. Every shot placed with surgical accuracy, every movement calculated to minimize bloodshed while maximizing effect." Luke Carson, now securely bound and awaiting transport to the territorial prison, had lost all trace of his former arrogance. The night's events had stripped away his illusions about power and control, leaving him with the hollow realization of how completely he'd underestimated his opponent. "You could have killed us all," he said, almost wonderingly, as Sullivan checked his bonds with mechanical precision. "With your skill, with that mechanical hand, with your men's precision, we never stood a chance. But you chose not to." "Killing is easy," Sullivan replied, the brass and steel components of his prosthetic catching the morning light as he adjusted Carson's restraints. "Any man with a gun can end a life. The true test of skill, of control, lies in choosing not to kill when you have every right and capability to do so." The mechanical fingers moved with fluid grace, each motion precise and purposeful. That's what separates soldiers from killers, precision from brutality. The war taught us that victory isn't about who can cause the most destruction. It's about who can maintain the most control. Matthew Carson, finally released from his confinement in the barn, surveyed the battlefield with a tactician's unwilling appreciation. Each position told its own story of military expertise, each disabled opponent a testament to the difference between random violence and calculated precision. "I tried to tell him," he said quietly to Sullivan, watching as his brother was led away. "Tried to explain what it meant when we heard the Iron Brigade was involved, but Luke never understood the difference between power and precision." He shook his head slowly, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. He brought an army of thugs against a military unit that helped win the bloodiest war in history. The outcome was inevitable from the moment he chose to test himself against men who had transformed warfare into a science. Captain Reynolds descended from his sniper's position as the morning sun cast long shadows across Thunder Valley, his specialized rifle slung across his back with military precision. The weapon, like Sullivan's mechanical hand, represented the marriage of engineering and warfare, a tool designed for accuracy rather than destruction. "Final count," he reported with professional crispness, falling into the familiar rhythm of their post-operation briefings. 27 wounded, all non-lethal injuries. Every shot placed exactly according to plan, every target disabled with surgical precision. The morning revealed the full scope of the Iron Brigade's tactical mastery. Doc Hayes and his assistants moved among the wounded, each injury they treated telling the same story of calculated efficiency. "I've treated battlefield wounds before," Hayes remarked to Sullivan as they surveyed the aftermath, "but never anything like this. Each shot placed precisely to incapacitate without killing, each injury designed to teach rather than destroy. You've turned warfare into a medical science." Sullivan's mechanical hand moved with characteristic grace as he assisted with the wounded, the brass and steel components catching the morning light. "The Army's engineers thought they were just replacing what I'd lost," he explained, the mechanical fingers working within human precision as he helped bandage a particularly complex shoulder wound. They didn't realize they were creating something more, a testament to how technology and skill could overcome brute force, how precision could replace power. Mary Cooper had organized the townspeople into an efficient support network, their actions unconsciously mimicking the military precision they'd witnessed through the night. As she coordinated medical supplies and prisoner transport, she noticed how the Iron Brigade maintained their disciplined approach even in victory. Every action was measured, every movement calculated, as if they couldn't help but approach even these mundane tasks with the same efficiency that had won them the battle. "They're not just veterans," she remarked to Eleanor Turner as they watched. "Sullivan and his men systematically secure the battlefield. They're living examples of what happens when skill and discipline replace brute force and intimidation. Every move they make, every task they complete, carries that same mechanical precision we saw in the fight." Sheriff Wheeler, overseeing the processing of prisoners with his deputy, found himself studying Sullivan's mechanical hand with newfound appreciation. The prosthetic wasn't just a replacement limb, it was a symbol of how the war had transformed. These men, how it had taught them to turn their losses into advantages, their wounds into weapons. "The territory's going to hear about this," he told Sullivan as they documented the prisoners' injuries. "Word's already spreading about how 5 men with military precision outmaneuvered and outfought a force 4 times their size." "Let them talk," Sullivan replied, the mechanical fingers moving with fluid grace as he signed the official reports. "Let them understand that true strength lies not in numbers or firepower, but in control and precision. The war taught us that victory belongs not to the side with the most men, but to those who understand how to apply force with surgical accuracy." The Iron Brigade's victory had transformed more than just the battlefield. Thunder Valley itself seemed different in the morning light, as if the demonstration of precision over chaos had awakened something in its residents. The townspeople moved with newfound purpose, their fear of the Carson gang replaced by the confidence that came from witnessing how discipline and skill could overcome any odds. Lieutenant Cooper, completing his final survey of the defensive mechanisms that had turned the ranch into a tactical masterpiece, approached Sullivan with a mix of professional pride and personal satisfaction. "The engineering performed exactly as designed," he reported, gesturing to the intricate network of traps and triggers that had controlled the battle's flow. "Every mechanism, every device worked with the same precision as your mechanical hand. We've refined our techniques considerably since the Shenandoah." Shadow Martinez emerged from his final sweep of the perimeter, moving with the ghost-like efficiency that had earned him his nickname. "The word's already reaching other towns," he reported, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who specialized in gathering intelligence. "Riders are spreading the story of how the Iron Brigade turned precision into power, how military discipline overcame brute force. This victory will reshape how the territory thinks about strength." The week following what would become known as the Thunder Valley demonstration transformed more than just the local landscape. As word spread across the territories, the story grew with each telling, though the truth needed no embellishment. Riders carried tales of how 5 military veterans had turned precision into an art form, how a mechanical hand guided by tactical genius had orchestrated a symphony of controlled violence that would reshape how the West thought about power. Sullivan stood on his porch in the late afternoon sun, watching as the territorial marshal's office processed the last of the prisoners. His mechanical hand moved with characteristic grace as he adjusted his weapon belt, each motion carrying the same precision that had defined their victory. The brass and steel components caught the light, a reminder of how technology and skill had overcome brute force and chaos. "The territorial governor wants to speak with you," Sheriff Wheeler reported, approaching with an official telegram in hand. "Word of what happened here has reached all the way to Cheyenne. They're calling it a revolution in frontier law enforcement, how military precision and tactical thinking can overcome overwhelming odds." The mechanical fingers moved with fluid grace as Sullivan accepted the telegram. "They're missing the point," he replied, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that had commanded the battlefield. This wasn't about law enforcement or military tactics. It was about proving that precision beats power, that control matters more than numbers. Every wound we inflicted, every shot we fired, every explosion we orchestrated served to demonstrate that principle. Captain Reynolds, who had remained to help train Wheeler's deputies in advanced marksmanship, nodded in agreement. "The Army taught us how to fight," he observed, cleaning his specialized rifle with methodical care. "But you showed us how to turn that fighting into something more precise, more controlled. The mechanical hand wasn't just a replacement limb, it was a symbol of how warfare could evolve." In town, the changes were already evident. Mary Cooper's store had become a gathering place where people discussed not just the battle, but its implications for the territory's future. The precision and discipline they'd witnessed had awakened something in the community, a realization that strength came in many forms. "It's changed how people think about protection," Mary explained to Eleanor Turner as they watched the town's new militia drill under Reynolds' supervision. "They used to believe safety came from having the most guns or the toughest reputation. No, they understand it comes from precision, from control, from knowing exactly how to apply force when necessary." Lieutenant Cooper, who had spent the week documenting their defensive innovations for the Territorial Marshal's office, approached Sullivan with a detailed report. "Every mechanism, every trap, every engineering principle we employed has been catalogued," he reported, his own precision matching that of Sullivan's mechanical hand. "The Marshal wants to implement similar systems in other troubled territories. They're calling it the Thunder Valley Protocol, using precision and tactical thinking to overcome superior numbers." Shadow Martinez materialized from his regular patrol, moving with the ghost-like efficiency that had become his trademark. "The words spreading beyond just the battle," he reported, his intelligence-gathering skills as sharp as ever. "Other towns are starting to understand what we demonstrated here. The days of brute force ruling the territories are ending. Precision is becoming the new power." Dr. Hayes, still treating the last of the wounded, had perhaps the most profound observation. "These injuries tell a story," he explained to his son Jimmy, who had started apprenticing with him after witnessing the Iron Brigade's precision. Each wound placed exactly where it would disable without killing, each shot calculated to teach rather than destroy. They didn't just win a battle, they provided a masterclass in controlled violence. The mechanical hand caught the late afternoon light as Sullivan considered the broader implications of their victory. The Army's engineers had designed it to replace what he'd lost, but it had become something more. A symbol of how technology and skill could transform warfare from an exercise in destruction into a demonstration of precision. "The territory will never be the same," Sheriff Wheeler observed. watching as another group of lawmen arrived to study the battlefield and learn from the Iron Brigade's techniques. You've shown them a new way to think about power, about control, about how to maintain order without resorting to mindless violence. Sullivan's response carried the weight of lessons learned through years of combat and refined through mechanical precision. The war taught us that victory doesn't always go to the side with the most men or the biggest guns. Sometimes it goes to those who understand that true strength lies in control, in knowing exactly how much force to apply and when to apply it. The mechanical hand wasn't just a replacement for what I lost. It was an evolution in how we think about power itself. 3 months after what historians would later call the Thunder Valley demonstration, the transformation of the Western Territories was already evident. The story of how 5 military veterans had turned precision into power had spread far beyond Wyoming, reshaping how people thought about strength and control in the frontier lands. The legend of the mechanical hand had grown, but unlike most frontier tales, the truth behind it proved more remarkable than any embellishment. Sullivan stood on his porch in the crisp autumn morning, watching as the first snow dusted the distant peaks. His mechanical hand moved with characteristic grace as he adjusted his gun belt, the brass and steel components catching the early light. The prosthetic had become more than just a replacement limb, or even a symbol of military precision. It had become a reminder that technology and skill could transform even the wildest territories into places where civilization could flourish. Another group of lawmen arriving from Dakota Territory, Sheriff Wheeler reported, approaching with his usual measured stride. The Thunder Valley Protocol, as it had come to be known, had drawn peace officers from across the frontier, eager to learn how precision and tactical thinking could overcome superior numbers. They want to study your methods, understand how 5 men with military training outmaneuvered and disabled a force 4 times their size without taking a single life. The mechanical fingers moved with fluid grace as Sullivan poured coffee for both of them. "They're still focusing on the wrong lessons," he observed, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that had commanded the battlefield. It wasn't about the numbers or even the tactics. It was about understanding that true power comes from control, from knowing exactly how much force to apply and when to apply it. Every shot we fired, every explosion we orchestrated, every wound we inflicted served to demonstrate that principle. In town, Thunder Valley had evolved into something unprecedented in the territories, a community where strength was measured not by the number of guns a man carried, but by the precision with which he used them. Mary Cooper's store, once threatened by Carson's brutality, had become a gathering place where visitors from across the frontier came to hear first-hand accounts of how military discipline had transformed frontier justice. "The Iron Brigade didn't just win a battle," she explained to a group of Eastern reporters who'd made the journey to document the changes. They provided a template for how civilization could establish itself in the wildest territories. Every action they took, every shot they fired, showed how precision could overcome chaos, how control could defeat brute force. Lieutenant Cooper, who had remained to help implement similar defensive systems in other troubled towns, approached with his latest engineering reports. The territorial governor had commissioned him to document and replicate the innovations that had turned Thunder Valley into an impregnable fortress. "The principles are spreading," he reported, his own precision matching that of Sullivan's mechanical hand. "Other communities are learning that technology and tactical thinking can be more powerful than mere numbers." Captain Reynolds, directing another marksmanship training session for regional lawmen, had incorporated the lessons of Thunder Valley into a comprehensive program. "Precision isn't just about hitting targets," he explained to his students. It's about understanding that every shot carries responsibility, that controlled force achieves more than random violence. Sullivan's mechanical hand didn't just inspire our tactics. It became a symbol of how warfare itself could evolve. Shadow Martinez, whose ghost-like efficiency had become legendary among frontier scouts, materialized with intelligence from his latest patrol. "The word has spread beyond just the territories," he reported. "Even the army's showing interest in what we demonstrated here. They're calling it the future of frontier peacekeeping, precision over power, control over chaos." Dr. Hayes, whose medical practice had evolved to incorporate lessons learned from the Iron Brigade's surgical precision, perhaps understood best what they had achieved. "Every wound they inflicted told a story," he explained to visiting physicians. "Each injury placed exactly where it would disable without killing, each shot calculated to teach rather than destroy. They turned violence itself into a science, showing that even in the wildest territories, precision could overcome barbarism." The mechanical hand caught the morning light as Sullivan considered how far their influence had spread. What had begun as a simple defense of his ranch had evolved into something far more significant, a demonstration that would reshape how the frontier territories thought about power and justice. The Army's engineers had designed his prosthetic to replace what he'd lost, but it had become something more profound, a symbol of how technology and skill could transform even the most chaotic environments into places where civilization could take root. "The territories will never be the same," Sheriff Wheeler observed, watching as another group of lawmen arrived to study their methods. "You've shown them that true strength lies not in having the most men or the biggest guns, but in knowing exactly how to apply force with surgical precision." Sullivan's response carried the weight of lessons learned through years of combat and refined through mechanical precision. "The war taught us that victory belongs not to those with the most resources, but to those who understand how to use what they have with perfect control. Every gear, every spring, every component of this mechanical hand represents that principle. We didn't just defend a ranch, we demonstrated how precision can transform even the wildest frontier into a place where justice prevails." As the morning sun painted the valley in autumn colors, Thunder Valley stood as a testament to how military precision and technological innovation could reshape the very nature of power in the American West. The legend of the mechanical hand would grow, but unlike most frontier tales, its true significance lay not in the violence it could inflict, but in the civilization it helped establish through the perfect marriage of precision and control. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.